The salt roads of medieval Europe. Salt, though today an ordinary kitchen ingredient, once sat at the very heart of life and survival. To you it may seem unremarkable, resting in a shaker on your table, casually scattered over food. Yet in medieval Europe, salt was not simply a seasoning, but an essential element in preserving life itself. Before refrigeration, before industrial canning, salt was the key to storing food for the lean months. It cured meat, preserved fish, hardened cheese, and allowed armies to march without their provisions rotting. Entire towns rose to prominence because of their access to salt deposits, while others fell into obscurity when trade routes shifted. As you imagine yourself traveling back, step into the world of the 12th century, where the economy of entire kingdoms was linked to a white crystalline substance scraped from marshes, mined from ancient underground seams, or boiled from seawater. The story is slow and deliberate, as it unfolds not with dramatic battles or kings, but with donkey caravans, brine pans, and ledgers written by clerks who tracked barrels of salt as though they were gold. The value of salt. To understand why salt was so significant, you must first picture life without it. In an age when winters were long and food supplies were unstable, the ability to preserve meat meant the difference between hunger and survival. Pork was salted heavily after slaughter. Fish from coastal waters was dried and cured, and even butter was packed with coarse grains to keep it from spoiling. In some regions, salted herring fed entire cities. Without salt, trade could not stretch far beyond the immediate harvest, and armies could not campaign during colder months. Salt also carried symbolic and even spiritual weight. In religious texts, salt represented purity and permanence. Contracts in parts of Europe were sealed with salt, and spilling it was seen as an omen. Yet its greatest weight was economic. It was costly to produce, laborious to transport, and tightly controlled by lords, bishops, and monarchs who understood its power. A sack of salt could be worth more than a laborer's wage for weeks, and tolls on salt roads filled the treasuries of kings. The production sites. Production of salt varied greatly depending on geography. Along the Atlantic coast of France, marshes near Guérande and the Bay of Biscay were transformed into intricate salt pans. These shallow pools allowed seawater to evaporate under the summer sun, leaving behind crystals that workers raked with long-handled tools. In Venice, families depended on Adriatic salt pans, their fortunes rising and falling with the delicate balance of tides and weather. Further inland, where seas were distant, salt came from the earth. The great mines of Central Europe, such as those at Hallien in Austria, became legendary. Miners extracted blocks of rock salt from caverns carved deep into the mountains, their flickering torches glinting off crystalline walls. Elsewhere, brine springs bubbled up from beneath the earth, and villagers boiled the salty water in iron kettles. The air around these works carried a sharp, biting scent, smoke rising constantly from furnaces fed with timber, much of it cut at unsustainable rates from nearby forests. The production of salt shaped local economies. Entire towns existed solely to support workers in the marshes or mines. Inns lined the roads for merchants, coopers fashioned barrels for storage, and guards patrolled the routes to prevent theft. Though little changed day by day, this steady rhythm of production sustained Europe in ways few travelers considered. The roads and trade. Transporting salt was as important as producing it. Special roads, known as salt roads, or Via Salaria, connected coastal marshes and inland mines to markets across Europe. These were not smooth cobbled highways, but long, uneven paths, marked by wooden posts and guarded toll stations. Caravans of pack animals, donkeys, mules, and oxen carts, moved slowly, bearing barrels of salt bound in rope. Each journey was measured not in days, but in weeks. A caravan from the salt pans of Venice might take months to reach the markets of Germany, moving across rivers and mountain passes where bandits waited. The routes carried not only salt, but also culture. Along these paths, ideas traveled with merchants, spreading new dialects, religious practices, and even fashion. Yet tolls and tariffs multiplied at every checkpoint, and rulers grew rich from the steady trickle of coins. In France, the gabelle, a royal tax on salt, became one of the most resented levies of the Middle Ages, so deeply unpopular that centuries later it would fuel discontent leading to the French Revolution. Still, in the 12th and 13th centuries, these salt roads held steady. Cities like Salzburg, whose very name means salt fortress, owed their existence to the substance. Venetian wealth, too, owed as much to its control of salt as it did to its navy. If you picture Venice, you may think of gondolas and canals, but behind those images lies the fact that its power depended on carefully guarded rights to Adriatic salt pans. The daily connection. For the peasant in a small village, the salt road might have seemed distant, yet its influence pressed into daily life in quiet, constant ways. A farmer slaughtering a pig in November would rub it down with coarse salt before hanging it in a shed. A fisherman gutting his catch would pack the flesh in barrels of brine before sending it to a distant city. Even the simplest soup required a pinch to bring flavor to otherwise bland boiled grains. Salt was rationed carefully. A household might have only a small pouch, kept dry and wrapped in cloth. It was never wasted, and to sprinkle it freely was a sign of wealth. Many families depended on the periodic arrival of merchants who traveled the roads, selling small quantities in exchange for grain or cloth. Thus, though the great salt caravans may have seemed far away, every person's life depended on their slow, steady movement across Europe. Quiet power. The true power of salt lay not in its taste, but in the invisible structures it created. It tied villages to markets, peasants to lords, merchants to kings. Every cartload represented not just food preservation, but also taxes, debts, and obligations. To own a salt pan or a brine spring was to control life itself, and so rulers guarded these rights jealously. The pace of this history is slow, measured in centuries. Nothing seemed dramatic in a single day. Merchants loading barrels, miners carving rock, peasants salting pork, but together it formed the backbone of medieval survival. When you look at the quiet rhythm of medieval life, salt was always present, shaping what could be eaten, traded, or stored. As this section closes, imagine the flicker of a candle illuminating a caravan driver's weary face as he guides his mules through the mud of a salt road. Without him, the distant village may starve in winter. Without his barrels, the kingdom's armies cannot march. A simple substance, crystalline and white, holds the fate of countless lives. But how did rulers ensure their control over this trade? And what systems of law and taxation grew around it? In the first part of this story, you saw how salt wound its way into the most ordinary details of life, from the marshes and mines to the kitchens of peasants. Now, in this second section, we move deeper into the structures that grew around it: laws, taxes, and systems of authority that stretched across kingdoms. These mechanisms may seem dry, but they reveal how rulers transformed a simple mineral into one of the most powerful instruments of control in medieval Europe. The ruler's grip. By the 12th and 13th centuries, salt had grown too valuable to be left in the hands of ordinary merchants. Kings and princes recognized its worth, and one by one they seized control of production sites, levied taxes, and established monopolies. In France, the monarchy imposed a system of salt taxation known as the gabelle. This levy was not uniform. It varied by region, with some provinces paying little, while others faced crushing burdens. The unevenness created resentment that would smolder for centuries, but at the time it ensured a steady stream of revenue for the crown. In the Holy Roman Empire, control of salt was often in the hands of bishops and abbots. The city of Salzburg, for instance, owed its prosperity not to conquest or trade in luxury goods, but to its archbishop's monopoly over the local salt mines. Revenues from these mines funded cathedrals, monasteries, and fortifications. The churchmen were careful stewards of their salt, understanding that their spiritual power rested, in part, on something as earthly as brine and crystals. In Venice, the Republic established state control over salt pans along the Adriatic. Every grain was recorded in state ledgers, and merchants were required to pass through official channels. Venetian salt was traded not only across Italy, but into Central Europe, where it became a staple of markets in Germany and Austria. Behind the grandeur of St. Mark's Basilica and the shimmer of Venetian glass stood the steady, bureaucratic machinery of salt regulation. The mechanisms of taxation. The collection of salt taxes followed a rhythm of dull regularity. In France, government officials known as gabelliers were tasked with overseeing storage depots and sales. Households in certain regions were legally required to purchase a fixed amount of salt each year, whether they needed it or not. These salt quotas ensured constant revenue, but burdened poor families who often struggled to meet the requirement. Depots called graniers à sel, literally salt barns, were established across the countryside. Here, the salt was weighed, priced, and distributed under official supervision. Long queues formed outside these barns, peasants carrying small sacks or containers, waiting their turn under the watchful eye of clerks. The barns were drab buildings of timber or stone, yet they became centers of economic life, binding entire regions to royal policy. Smuggling quickly became a byproduct of taxation. Known as fauxonniers, salt smugglers carried contraband in hidden compartments or transported it at night across regional boundaries. Punishments for smuggling could be severe, yet the practice persisted, driven by the need of ordinary people to escape burdensome costs. Thus, around the salt trade, a shadow economy grew, one that rulers tried endlessly to suppress. Salt as political power. Salt revenues were not only economic, they were deeply political. Wars were financed with the income. Alliances were secured by granting or withholding rights to production, and entire campaigns depended on securing access to brine. In England, the Crown regulated salt works along the coast, particularly in Cheshire, where large deposits supported a thriving industry. English kings understood that without salt, the provisioning of armies would falter. During conflicts such as the Hundred Years' War, the role of salt became especially visible. Armies marching through France required salted meat and fish, supplied through carefully guarded chains of production and distribution. Monarchs who could guarantee steady supplies won loyalty and endurance from their soldiers. Those who failed to do so saw their forces starve or scatter. In many ways, salt taxation was an early form of centralization. Where once local lords had profited from regional mines or marshes, now central authorities increasingly demanded oversight. The pattern repeated across Europe, local independence fading as monarchs and city-states tightened their hold over the resource. Urban centers and guilds. As salt moved along its slow routes, cities rose to prominence as waypoints. Towns like Lüneburg in northern Germany became synonymous with salt, their guilds controlling trade and dictating the rules under which merchants could operate. Guilds enforced quality standards, determined prices, and maintained records, all within a framework that was deeply conservative, changing little over centuries. The production of barrels, too, became an industry tied to salt. Coopers' guilds flourished, their work essential for packing and transporting the mineral. A well-sealed barrel might travel hundreds of miles without spoilage, while a poorly made one could result in costly losses. Thus, even trades seemingly distant from salt, woodcutting, carpentry, smithing, found themselves drawn into its orbit. The human side. For all the grand structures of taxation and trade, salt remained grounded in human toil. Miners worked in darkness, their lungs filled with dust. Workers in marshes bent over long-handled rakes, their skin cracked from constant exposure to brine. Teamsters guided oxen along muddy tracks, their carts creaking under the weight of barrels. Clerks hunched over ledgers by candlelight, recording every sack. None of these lives seemed dramatic, but all were tied to the slow circulation of salt. A single meal on a noble's table, roast pork seasoned and preserved, was the end point of a long chain of labor and oversight. When you follow the story backwards, you return not to kings or armies, but to the miner's hammer, the marsh worker's rake, and the merchant's weary mule. Quiet resentments. The burden of salt taxation did not pass unnoticed. Villagers grumbled at the quotas. Merchants bristled under the watchful eye of customs officers, and smugglers risked punishment for a chance at profit. In some cases, revolts erupted, though rarely on a grand scale. These were not revolts of banners and battles, but of small, desperate acts. A barn set aflame, an officer harassed in the night, a shipment diverted onto back roads. The quiet resentment built slowly, like sediment in a river. No one act seemed revolutionary, yet over centuries, the weight accumulated. When you later hear of the French Revolution and the storming of the Bastille, you should remember that among the grievances was something as seemingly small as the gabelle. Behind great upheavals often lie the most mundane irritations, repeated endlessly until they grow unbearable. A system that held. Despite the discontent, the system of salt taxation and monopoly endured. It endured because rulers relied on it, because armies needed it, and because no substitute existed. Year after year, peasants walked to the barns, merchants loaded their carts, and rulers counted their revenues. The cycle turned with quiet regularity, a rhythm as constant as the seasons. As this section ends, you might picture a peasant leaving a salt barn at dusk, a small pouch clutched tightly in his hand. He mutters at the expense, yet knows that without it, his family cannot preserve meat for winter. The barn looms behind him, its stone walls heavy with authority, while ahead lies the long walk back to his village. The long legacy of salt. In the first two sections, you followed salt from marshes and mines into markets, tax barns, and the hands of rulers who recognized its power. Now, in this final part of the story, we turn toward the legacy it left, how a substance so ordinary influenced the shape of governments, economies, and even revolutions. This is a story not of sudden changes, but of gradual weight, built layer upon layer until history bent under its pressure. Salt as infrastructure. When we think of infrastructure today, we imagine roads, bridges, or ports. In medieval and early modern Europe, salt was itself a kind of infrastructure. Roads were designed with its transport in mind. Canals were dug to move it more efficiently, and entire towns were positioned near mines or salt pans. The trade shaped geography as much as rivers or mountains did. The Via Salaria in Italy, an ancient Roman road that persisted through the Middle Ages, literally bore the name of salt. From the salt works at Ostia, it carried carts inland, supplying Rome and its hinterland for centuries. In France, similar routes stretched from the Atlantic marshes into the heart of the kingdom. These paths of salt eventually became the foundations of more modern trade networks. It is striking to notice how many European cities can trace their prosperity back to salt. Lüneburg in Germany, Salzburg in Austria, Venice in Italy, and even parts of Paris all carried wealth forward from this one mineral. Though modern visitors admire their cathedrals, guild halls, and palaces, The bedrock of that wealth was something as mundane as brine and crystal. Political consequences. The taxation systems built on salt were among the earliest experiments in centralized bureaucracy. In France, the gabelle provided the monarchy with a model of how to extend authority into rural villages, enforce quotas, and maintain permanent record keeping. Later tax systems on wine, tobacco, and grain borrowed their structure from this template. This administrative expansion had a double effect. On one hand, it allowed monarchs to finance wars and centralize power, laying the groundwork for the modern nation-state. On the other hand, it seeded resentment that would eventually fuel revolutions. Ordinary people did not always rebel against lofty ideals. Often, they rebelled against the dull grind of daily obligations. And in France, one of those obligations was the salt tax. Indeed, when the French Revolution erupted in 1789, pamphlets and grievances repeatedly mentioned the gabelle. Its abolition in 1790 was cheered not only as a triumph of liberty, but as a relief from a long and irritating burden. Here, you see how the slow accumulation of resentment towards something as ordinary as salt could help topple an entire monarchy. Economic shifts. The centrality of salt began to decline in the 18th and 19th centuries. Advances in food preservation, such as canning, refrigeration, and new chemical methods, gradually loosened its hold on daily survival. Yet, even as salt's practical necessity diminished, its role in shaping Europe lingered in institutions, place names, and collective memory. Industrialization gave salt a new purpose, no longer primarily for food, but for chemical processes, glassmaking, soap production, and later, chlorine and soda ash. The mineral that had once driven caravans and smuggling rings now powered factories. The infrastructure remained, but the meaning shifted. Cultural impressions. Salt left its mark not only on economies, but on language and ritual. To this day, you still find echoes in phrases such as "worth his salt" or "salt of the earth." In medieval Europe, salt was used in contracts and ceremonies, sprinkled as a sign of preservation and loyalty. Its presence at the table, often in ornate containers called salt cellars, signified not just flavoring but rank. Where one sat in relation to the salt cellar at a noble's table indicated social standing. Closer meant higher status. Further away meant lesser. Superstitions also attached themselves to salt. Spilling it was considered unlucky, an omen requiring a pinch tossed over the left shoulder. These customs traveled through centuries, attaching themselves to a mineral that once determined survival itself. The human cost. Behind this long story were the workers. Generations of miners in Salzburg, marsh rakers in Garand, mule drivers along the Via Salaria, and smugglers who risked punishment along the French countryside. Their names were rarely recorded, yet their labor sustained households, armies, and kingdoms. One can picture, for instance, a miner deep in the tunnels of Hallstatt in Austria. His work was monotonous, hour after hour of hammering rock, hauling loads, and enduring the damp. He might never have seen the grand cathedrals built with revenues from his toil, yet his effort, multiplied across generations, carried Europe through centuries of reliance on salt. The legacy today. Walk through certain European towns, and you still encounter traces of this history. Salt barns stand preserved as museums. Streets carry names like Salt Market or Salzgasse. In places such as Lüneburg or Garand, salt production continues, though more as heritage than as survival. Tourists admire the beauty of crystalline pans, unaware that for medieval peasants, these same landscapes meant long hours of exhausting work. It is easy to forget how something so ordinary shaped so much. But if you follow the chain from a modern kitchen shaker back through time, you arrive in a medieval salt barn, in the hands of a smuggler, or on the shoulders of a peasant trudging home with his yearly quota. The continuity is quiet but undeniable. Closing reflection. Salt's story is not one of sudden drama, but of long persistence. It crept into law codes, shaped trade routes, built cities, funded wars, and provoked revolutions. Its crystals sparkled faintly in every ledger, every barn, every army ration. And in that faint sparkle, entire centuries of history were written. So as you drift into sleep, think of salt not as a seasoning, but as a thread, binding economies, households, and kingdoms together, invisible yet unbreakable for centuries. The next time you reach for a pinch of it, you might pause to consider, what other ordinary things in your life will one day be remembered as the quiet foundations of history?